But I think we can only fully forgive from a real place, not from a superficial place. And sometimes just coming to that place of how injured I am takes time. And I think even the process of forgiveness is, it's not kind of usually one fundamental, wholehearted, from the deepest place of my soul moment. It may take that, but I think often we forgive in fragments. So we forgive at the level that we feel hurt, and then we maybe realise actually below that there's another level of hurt and another level of hurt. I think that's why it's embedded in this prayer, because I think we're being given a realisation here. This is not something which is just a one-time fix, but it's actually something we have to practice.
Welcome to Calling a City to Life, a podcast by Queen's Park Baptist Church in Glasgow. We are gathered, the four of us. It is at exactly 3 minutes past 4, a pleasant afternoon. By 4 minutes past 4, it could be thunder and lightning if today is anything to go by. Quickly followed by snow, quickly followed by hailstones, and then probably back to a sunny sky and dark moonlit night and all the rest of it. So apologies in advance if at some point through this recording you hear the pitter-patter of rain in the background, because today's weather is slightly unpredictable. But what is predictable is that the three of us are here. So Brodie,
three of us?
Four.
What did I say? Well, it's four of us. I'm here.
Yeah.
You said the three of us are here.
Did I? Oh, the three of you are there. So it should be the three of you are there and I can see you on my screen. So, Brodie, how are you?
I'm well. You've confused me already, Richard.
Off to a good start. Off to a good start. Jack, how are you doing?
Well, concerned about your ability to count, but otherwise fine.
Good. And Ian, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm just wondering if I'm supernumerary or whether I'm one of the three or one of the four.
All right,
Ooh.
okay. Well,
confused.
That's going back to like Revelation, the chosen. Like, it turns out it wasn't 144,000, it was 4, or was it 3? But that's a whole different podcast series. Well, today we are speaking about Ian's sermon. You may have noticed that we kind of skipped an episode, or skipped a week recording a podcast, so you're going to get to enjoy 2 this week. So we're going to delve back and see if Ian can remember what he said from a fortnight ago, and give him 60 seconds to either scramble around his notes or instantly recall what he said and what he spoke about. So Ian, over to you.
So I was talking about forgiveness, and forgiveness being a way of life. So it's really important that none of us have forgotten this, but that we actually put it into practice. So the theme was from the Lord's Prayer, as all our recent themes have been. And Jesus locates at the heart of the prayer this very intentional moment of forgiveness. And basically my point was that forgiving others in particular, is essential for our spiritual well-being. And actually when we forgive others, that maintains our relationship with God. So we went on to think about how we dealt with what's been done to us, with incidents and accidents that we've experienced. And I kind of broke that into 2 areas. So things that were actually done to us, and then the whole area where we get into what we might call judgments, building a perception, telling ourselves a narrative of what has been done to us, and then kind of coming out of that by saying we all need to forgive. And fundamentally, forgiveness is about releasing the other person from our intent to bring vengeance and retribution. So I think that's it in a sort of a nutshell.
And if only forgiveness was quite that easy, and all we needed was a wee summary, and then we were all sorted. Because this is a deeply challenging topic. I know that I found it deeply challenging when you spoke about it, and I think it's fair to say it's going to be quite hard to kind of go through your sermon in a linear way without going on some little rabbit trails in the process. Not least because I think it's really helpful to talk about some practical things and questions that have sort of come up as a result of that. I think one of the things I wanted to start by asking was that I think that a lot of our hurts, we end up feeling like they need validation somehow because we've been wounded, and our sense of unforgiveness can often come from that desire within us to have our pain seen. And I wondered if you had some advice about what a healthy response to wounding is, rather than finding ourselves immediately in that place of unforgiveness.
Well, I think when we are wounded, Jackie, it sets a whole process in motion, doesn't it? And that motion has something to do with trying to right the scales of injustice. So it is tapping into something that God has put within us, that things need to be put right. And one of the things that a process does for us is to help us to identify that what has happened to us has truly been hurtful. So identifying the hurt, identifying that that has caused pain, that has created certain repercussions in terms of our emotions is actually really important. I think I totally get that whole thing where we want to be validated, and I think there's wars have been created intergenerationally because people have taken their heart and used that to inflame other people as well. And there's probably two things there. One is that we all need to be very careful about buying into somebody else's heart and owning their heart. But also when we are hurt, trying to find ways that are really healthy to deal with that. And that may well mean that we do have to find somebody who is a safe person, but a safe person is not necessarily somebody who agrees with us. But a safe person is someone who can help us with the process and doesn't get enmeshed in the process themselves. And that's a really difficult thing because we all want somebody to be on our side. And we actually, part of the way in which we falsely seek healing is basically to get a whole team of people who agree with us and who join our tribe. And that's not healing, that's actually fueling. So we do need to find a place where we have that level of challenge. And I think part of that challenge needs to be the push to move into forgiveness. And it might not be immediate, but if somebody is just simply validating our heart and helping us just to get stuck in that place, then that's not really healing. That's just emphasizing the issue. So I think it's important that we find people, but we don't kind of go around all of our friends asking them to join our group of complaint, but finding somebody. Of course, part of that is expressing that before God. It may mean writing it down in some kind of way. I think people do different things to actually identify it. It might mean speaking it out in the right context. I think personally I've found that as well sometimes, not necessarily identifying who has hurt you in a public environment, but sometimes like a liturgy of prayer where you actually have to express something out loud without necessarily naming names can be really helpful because it pulls you through that process.
Brodie, Ian's response is making me think back to you talking about the importance of understanding the identity of God as Abba in all of this. And I was wondering if you had any comment to make in relation to what Ian has said about exactly that sense of if we are confident in him as Abba, then we can be confident in him seeing and understanding our pain.
Yeah, as Ian was speaking, that's exactly where my head was going to, of, in one sense, we can be proactive around this. There's a whole industry on TV and film, isn't there, kind of like in soap operas and things like that, of characters whose identities revolve around the grievances and hurts which they nurse. And when we live in a culture where that in many respects is the norm, it's very hard for us not to also, to lesser greater degree, be shaped by that, or perhaps it was the environment which we grew up in, where we're kind of like defined by what's been done to us or by grievances and things like that. I was thinking of, in the Middle Ages, people had fantastic names like George the Grumpy or whatever of, almost becomes, I don't know if there was a George the Grumpy, but you know what I mean, of these hurts become part of who we are. And therefore, there's a hesitancy to let it go in some respects, but the prayer is a whole thing. We've treated it as separate clauses, which is helpful to do, and what, we can pray it in separate clauses as well. But fundamental, the anchor point to this is the start of God is Abba, and the implication of that is that we are then His children. So the person who has offended me just isn't some stranger, but it's a brother or sister. But my fundamental identity is not as the offended one, or the hurt one, or the broken one, but as a child of God, and therefore that's both my starting point and my destination of returning back to that and getting rid of the baggage that I've picked up. So I think that's it's that wonderful line that Iain had from Burns's poem of Tam O'Shanter's wife, of the tendency or the temptation for us is to nurse our hurts rather than deal with them, because dealing with them can seem hard and scary or uncomfortable, or, as I say, it's become part of our image, our identity, and we're worried about losing our sense of self because we're going to give something away. Whereas if our sense of self is totally built upon the rock who is God as our Father, then there's not that worry about, if I give this hurt away, there's less of me. Hey, it's a good thing to give our hurt away, because actually then there's more of the real me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could we talk a little bit about the difference between forgiving someone and condoning what they've done? Because I think sometimes we can get a bit confused by that, and there are, I'm sure people listening have been grieved in very real ways, and that it would be very easy, were we to sit down and talk to them, to be sucked into the narrative of wanting to keep inflaming it, because it is painful and it has been wrong by anyone's measure. But God isn't saying that in asking us to forgive. It's a completely different thing, right?
Yeah, I think there's also just a popular perception that we have that somehow in order to forgive you have to minimize the offense, or that forgiving is minimizing the offense. And this maybe also comes back to another aspect of God's character that we haven't really expressed, which is that the idea of God as being just and a judge. And the scripture says that vengeance is the Lord's. And I think there's a mercy in that, because it's not that we are overlooking something. We are just, in forgiving, we are recognizing that we are not the judge and that we don't have to be the judge, but there is a judgment. And so often when you are forgiving somebody, what you're doing is you're releasing them into God's hands, not keeping them in yours. And I think that's super hard, because, we feel that our continued condemnation of somebody is holding is kind of pushing things back towards justice. I'm doing this because I have been wronged, and I need to know that this is wrong, and they need to know that it's wrong. But actually that then binds us to what some people would describe as the second heart, which is not only the heart of the incident, but is the heart of what's going on in ourselves. And so that injustice has to go somewhere. And I think, in Christian faith, we have both the promise that God is a judge, and also the promise that on the cross all wrongs are seen and expressed and taken for what they are.
Yeah, Jackie, I think you're right that there can be this popular kind of like conception that to forgive is to pretend that something bad hasn't happened, where biblically actually the opposite is true. to forgive, we need to name the wrong that has happened, as Ian has said. So it's actually exposing something, bringing something to the light, bringing it to the foot of the cross, bringing it to the person who offended us or has wronged us, if possible. That's not always possible, and very often that can be a process in and of itself as well. But biblical forgiveness is not about pretending or minimising, as Ian has said, something bad and something wrong hasn't happened. Neither is catastrophising something that's minor. You know, there's a whole level of different things here, isn't there? There are some things that are by definition traumatic and therefore very serious and hard to work through and all that sort of stuff. Other things that are minor. But the thing that ties all of these things together is that forgiveness involves naming what was done as hurtful, as something that is in need of a repair, of forgiveness. So it actually treats the thing with the seriousness that it is due, because it's wounded us in some way, and as Ian kind of like brought out of the problem with unforgiveness is that it ties us up in knots. It places us in a prison that allows someone else or something else to live rent free in our head, which damages our relationships with God and our relationship with each other. So yeah, it's not let's pretend something bad didn't happen or even forget. You know, we don't necessarily forget, but we remember differently, because we don't remember with bitterness or with anger. And again, that's a process and a journey.
I think it's a valid or an important part of this conversation, though, because when I think back, I mean, I was raised in a Christian family, and when I think back to my childhood, forgiveness was like the watchword of life. It was the very definition of how we were supposed to live every day. And I think sometimes as a young child, I can remember feeling like there wasn't a place for the pain that I had experienced. And I think that it's important that we understand that God deeply cares about the painful things that have happened to us in our life, and is very, very aware of it, and also grieved by it. You know, that is important, because I think otherwise you just end up feeling that you're just constantly being wronged in a way that doesn't matter, when actually it does. And forgiveness isn't about it not mattering. It does matter. But then also there's the place of there's nothing that's ever happened to us. There's no wrong. There's no anything when compared to all that ever happened to Jesus. And sometimes we can just think our grievance is greater than anyone else's. So it's just it's deeply complex.
But I think we can only fully forgive from a real place, not from a superficial place. And sometimes just coming to that place of how injured I am takes time. And I think even the process of forgiveness is, it's not kind of usually one fundamental, wholehearted, from the deepest place of my soul moment. It may take that, but I think often we forgive in fragments. So we forgive at the level that we feel hurt, and then we maybe realize actually below that there's another level of hurt and another level of hurt. I think that's why it's embedded in this prayer, because I think we're being given a realization here that this is not something which is just a one-time fix, but it's actually something we have to practice in various ways, really, in order to dig up the depths of what is actually there. And I think it can be very easy to forgive from a very superficial place. And I think it can be very easy to begin to think that what you're doing in forgiving is somehow validating the other person. And yet the other person may never change. They may always be very difficult to deal with. And actually you will need to put some boundaries in place. It might be appropriate never to see them again, and to put in some really kind of strict structure around to ensure that you're not you're not injured again. So it's not about letting somebody off. It's not about assuming that they've changed. It's actually dealing with the fact that somebody else having an effect on you is an effect that remains with you, and you're going on being injured by that, and that is not, it's not necessary. There's a way out of that.
Richard, I promised to let you get a word in edgeways, but I'm just one question, and then you can ask some. I'm sorry. There are some things that have happened to people which are completely horrific, and things that I can't even imagine. If your children have been murdered or abuse of all sorts, is anything unforgivable? I mean, I know the answer. Can you explain why the principle is the same at all ends of grading of sin?
Unless you're going to break with 2,000 years of Christian history dramatically on a podcast.
I mean, clearly forgiveness is a practice to ensure our healing. And if somebody has been very deeply traumatized and hurt, they still need to find that way of healing. And that's not to suggest it's easy, it's to suggest that it's really, really hard. But forgiveness is recognizing that something deeply injurious has happened to you. So there is that fundamental recognizing of this, but it's also a choice that you will not live under that, and you'll not allow that injury to continue having an impact. And there may well be other things. It's part of a network of responses. You know, that recovery from a deep injury is not just about forgiving the perpetrator, but there are other things in terms of reconstructing our own souls, our own relationship with God, our own sense of self and identity that are all part of that healing journey as well.
And I think Ian said something that's really important in his previous answer about sometimes things become fragmented. So we forgive, and then kind of like we see that person or something happens and those old feelings come back, and we think, oh, what a failure I am. You know, I thought and actually most times we're not a failure. Actually what we're dealing with is another level of wounding that has occurred from that one event, but it's kind of like fragmented. So we've got lots of forgiveness to do that can be around one offence, and therefore it takes time. So I think an encouragement to people is don't be discouraged because, you know, you're revisiting something. And I think going back to something you said earlier, well, something I think you said, maybe I've not heard and misheard, but there's a danger, isn't there, that we say to people, oh, you just need to forgive. And I'd like to get rid of the word just.
Just.
Because it makes it sound something trivial and simple, and it's not. It's difficult and it's hard. I think there's a promise that the Spirit works with us in this to strengthen us and enable us. But the just minimises the hurt. And something can look trivial from the outside, but really wound us in the inside. And therefore, I think we've got to be careful in how we care for each other within this of you just need to forgive. Of sometimes it's not that simple because there's an old wound there that's been opened up by something else. So it's not just forgive. It's God help me to forgive. Because this is important for me and important for the health of my health and the health of us as a community and your people.
And I think it's important that we talk about the fact that we can go through a process of forgiving and praying that we forgive someone. Sorry, having headphone disasters. That we go through the process of forgiveness and then can still have the feelings, and realizing that that's okay. We need to revisit it, because oftentimes it can take more than one go. I know that for me, there are some things where I need to just keep bringing it and keep bringing it and keep bringing it. Having said that, the flip side of it is I know I've really dealt with something when I forget about it, and it's no longer a conversation that I want to have with anyone. It's not like a live thing that I need to tell someone. And I think that can be a good benchmark sometimes of whether or not we've actually let it go. Because is it something you still are pursuing validation for by trying to have conversations with your friends about?
Yeah, I just kind of wonder as well, Jackie, maybe I'm going to be a little bit heretical here. I think if you've been injured in a very specific way or in a particular context, it gives you a sensitivity to that. And you may not have feelings of vengeance, maybe you do, but you may also have warning signals. So you may find yourself in a context where you're with different people from the people maybe who hurt or injured you, or a different situation. But there are signals in that situation that you're sensitized to. So I think from that point of view, so I'm just throwing out a thought that maybe not everything is cleared away, that maybe actually there's a little bit of, maybe it's redemptive as well, that God puts in you maybe an early warning system. Maybe there's something beyond being triggered by something where you begin to recognize, this is unhealthy, this is inappropriate, they haven't changed, or, that's still an issue for me. And it just makes you a little bit more alert, and maybe alert to your own heart, but also alert to things that could damage you. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say, I think that whilst those feelings of bitterness and vengeance might go, they might be replaced by different feelings that actually could be productive and helpful. I don't know if anybody agrees with me on that, but I'm just saying that.
I think that's good. I think you're saying that there's a difference between just completely forgetting about something altogether. I'm not saying not wipe the slate clean, but you're saying that it's possible to keep the wisdom that you've gained from something, as it were, like that you can have learned something in the process about relationship and how you're in relationship and how you're responding, and you can keep that as a helpful tool for your life.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the split between, Paul and Silas, and the kind of John Mark episode where Paul says, I don't want him on my mission anymore. And then at the end of Paul's ministry time, he is much more receptive to John Mark. And I haven't got the text here, maybe we can put it in the notes, but where he actually then has clearly forgiven and moved and is prepared to have more of a relationship and sees value in him. So I think there can be a real journey with this, and yeah, just our sensitivities to where we are at and where the other people or persons might be over time can change.
So the question I'm left, there's a number of questions left. One of the questions left is, how important is the other person in all of this? So if you're perceiving that, or you feel, or you've identified something that you feel you need to forgive someone for, and we'll deal with the situation. I'll ask another question later on, but I'll preface it here of saying, well, what happens if someone comes up and says to you, I forgive you for that, and you're like, none the wiser as to what they're talking about. But like, okay, that's really great, but I wasn't really aware I'd done something that required forgiveness. But how important is the other person or group in this in order for you? Like, does it matter? Should you be speaking to people? Is it all between you and God? Is it a mix and match approach? Is it situational sensitivity? Give us some thoughts.
Well, let me give you a picture, and then Brodie can give you some thoughts. So the picture is of a bridge, and if you imagine that the incident between you and the other person is like a bridge that's collapsed, so there's a brokenness between your relationship. Forgiveness is about building back your side of the bridge. It's about constructing the foundations on your side, in your heart, in my head. It doesn't necessarily do anything for the person on the other side of the bridge. And the danger is that we try and build a bridge of reconciliation without actually having forgiveness, which is often what people try and do. They try and sort something out without actually dealing with the bitterness or the reaction that's in their heart, and they just bring the reaction and they bring the bitterness back into the conversation. So the way that I see it is that forgiveness is building up your side. Reconciliation is the bridge, but that requires the other person to have accepted, confessed that they've got something wrong so that they can build from their end. So if that kind of gives us maybe a picture to talk about, I will hand back to you guys to come back at me.
Brodie?
That's a helpful picture. I mean, I think the reality and the practicalities are it's not always possible to involve the other person. The other person may be deceased. You may not be able to communicate them in a way. They might not be receptive. I mean, I think, because I can remember as like an older teen doing that of seeking somebody's forgiveness and just going about it such a poor way that it just backfired spectacularly. Of, going up to somebody and saying, "You really hurt me," is not a good opener. I mean, actually, somebody did this quite well with me recently. I was in a meeting situation and said something that I should have said to them privately, but said to the whole meeting. And the next day they said to me, "Listen, can I just have a word?" And then they explained, "Listen, that was a bit embarrassing for you to share that with the whole group. You should have really just spoken to me." And when they said it, I was like, "You're absolutely right. I'm really sorry about that." And it was done well. I learned from it. Relationship was kept good because there wasn't that unease. So there is an importance of where we can to kind of like, and it's part of that, it's not just forgiveness, it's forgiveness. This is important. This is a big thing, or often can be a big thing there's a moment of the person who has done hurt to realise, actually, I did something there that was hurtful. And to become aware of some of our blind spots or behaviours that I have that, now that takes a maturity on the other side of not just, you're being oversensitive or whatever, doesn't it? And that's the risk, isn't it? If we go and have that conversation. So they're difficult conversations to have, and we need to think about how we do those well. But as Iain said, the other person may not respond, or may respond with further hurt. But that doesn't mean that we don't forgive the person, because it's about us building our side of the bridge and knowing a freedom that comes from that. There are cases as well where, do you know what, it's not safe to approach the other person, particularly if there's been physical violence and other kinds of violence involved. And therefore it's something that we need to do with wisdom. And I think that's something Iain said earlier on, that having a safe person to talk some of this through can be a good first step. So if it's something fairly minor, if I did something to offend anybody in this call, hopefully, well, anybody in this that I can see on the screen, sorry, I don't know who's all listening to this, but I know all of you well enough that I would hope that if I did something inadvertently to offend you, that you would just kind of like speak to me about it, call me out on it, say, Brodie, I mean,
I've been meaning to speak to you, Brodie.
Yeah, well, but there's bigger stuff, isn't there? Of where, do you know what? We maybe need to do some processing with somebody else first to kind of like think what is a safe and sensible route, what's achievable here. And
I think that's why also just the forgiveness piece is important, because I think if you are confronting somebody or calling somebody out, and hopefully doing that in an appropriate way, if you're still full of vengeance and anger, it is totally not going to work. So actually there is something about having processed this, having built my side of the bridge, it actually gives me a foundation to go to the other person and say, do you know what, this is how it felt on this end of it. I'm not sure that's really what you meant, but do you know, that's how I experienced it. So I think there's a way in which you can do that feedback in a healthy way. But as Brodie says, there's a limit to that, and that there are some people, and probably the most difficult situations are with people who you can't really negotiate with and you can't really engage with. And what you have to then do is to try and form an appropriate boundary that protects you. And you may have to, this is where it comes to other issues of justice more widely. You may have to act to provide protection for other people as well that could be injured. And it gets really complex. But I think we need to perceive that forgiveness is part of a journey, and it's a first step. It's a really important first step, but there are other elements as well.
So I recently read, it's a very, very small book. It's like 2 chapters, but it's Carol and John Arnott's Grace and Forgiveness book from like 30 years ago or whenever. And John Arnott sets out a really good chapter, which is more sort of theology based, and then Carol is talking more about her experiences in relation to her mother. And I think it's a really, really helpful book. It's also got really useful prayers at the back for, to use as templates. So they're highly recommended. But she also she's talking about how in her process of forgiving, you can sort of trace a journey that she goes through because she starts to step into more relationship with her mother, because forgiveness allows love to grow in our hearts, where oftentimes we haven't been able to love before. And I think that's an interesting part of a softening of our hearts that happens when we start to let go of the things that are no longer serving us well. And I think you see that evident. It's not appropriate in every case, and I'm not suggesting it is, but for her with her mum, where she's trying to deal with, a lot of historic stuff, but trying to then step into a new relationship with her when her mum is much older. It's lovely to read how just the slow trickle of her love towards her mother makes way for actually that reconciliation. But it started by her doing her own business with her forgiveness first.
Yeah, and people would say in sort of family systems theory and sort of relational dynamics that actually what we try to do is we try to fix the other person, but rather than living out of a new place that we adopt. And actually according to this, some of these approaches, I'm just trying to work on it myself, but actually you stepping in and working in a relational context in a way that is different. So you're actually not buying into the dynamic of victim and perpetrator, but you're not enmeshed in that kind of a dynamic, but you've taken a different step. Actually changes the whole dynamic because the game is up. You've broken the rules of the game, and I think that can be really effective as well. But that also requires people to be in a much better position in terms of their own maturity and of their own hearts and forgiveness.
I mean, Confession Corner, the thing that I'm aware that I do is that if I have been wronged, it's then very easy for me to then get into a place of judgment with the other person in how they've responded to me and then how I generally feel toward them. And then I can start to have an attitude towards them. And the next thing you know, the whole thing's grown arms and legs. And I think that I'm very innocently sitting in the place of, will they wrong me first? And part of that has also been the mind reading that you talked about. Talk to me some about what it looks like to be self-aware enough to put the brakes on before the whole thing's grown the arms and legs.
I think that's the first step to becoming self-aware. I don't think it's even a self-aware. I think it is actually, do you know what? In your head, have a little phrase which says, stop the mind reading already. Because I think actually we get so into that. It really is the process of judgment, isn't it? That you start off with an opinion and that opinion becomes a stated fact and that fact becomes a judgment, and then you get stuck in that whole place. So I just think I've just found it really helpful that little phrase of, am I just assuming all of this? What makes me think this? Why have I developed this whole story? Why have I filled all of these blanks with all of this information? And why do I feel the need to? I think that's the other thing. I almost have to have a justification for why somebody is acting the way that they are. So you do kind of create this whole narrative, and then you realise after time that you haven't actually even questioned that or interrogated or asked them about why they're acting in a certain kind of a way. And it's so easy. There was a guy I used to be on a leadership team with, really great guy, loved him to bits, and we had a bit of a time when we were discussing how we made decisions. And I always thought I had to have like screeds and screeds of paper and proposals, and so I kind of had this whole mentality about Bill and how what he would need in order to make a decision. And so I was producing all this kind of stuff. We need to do this, need to do that. And eventually had the conversation, and he said, Ian, I don't really need all of that stuff. I just like making decisions. And it was just very decisive. So that whole thing of I had projected into his mind because I saw certain things that he required information to make decisions. And he said, no, I don't. I'm just decisive. And I think it's just very, very easy to make all of these assumptions and projections about people and where they're coming from. And it just becomes a real challenge for us, a real difficulty for us.
I think the stop mind reading thing has been a phenomenal output for me from this series in terms of just a really nice little aid memoir. Just stop mind reading. Whatever it is, just stop mind reading.
Including with your wife, just generally, by the way.
Mostly with my wife in general, it has to be said.
But I think the other side to that, Richard, I think is stop mind reading, be curious. And actually, to then, instead of, I mean, it doesn't have to be in husband-wife, it can be in a meeting or something where, you jump to a conclusion because you think, well, that person's always going to be grumpy about that. And actually to stop and to ask questions and to try and find out what's going on actually can lead you to a different kind of solution altogether. So I just think it's also quite a productive thing. It's not just a stop the problem. It's actually, okay, so why are you thinking what you're thinking? Or tell me what you're thinking here. I find that just really helpful.
And that kind of leads me to my most excellent question that I was going to ask moments ago and I remembered, which is, Brodie, you touched on it about doing the right thing badly. Ian, your invitation to curiosity. You're both experienced pastors. You've been there, seen it done many different ways. Can you actually give us what was the best way? I mean, we're not talking about grave offences, things that are really difficult, but you're kind of, for want of a better word, the run-of-the-mill stuff, whereby it's just people rubbing up against people. Is there a good way, a good example as to how to get into that conversation? We're living in Scotland, for goodness sake, where it takes a lot to get past the "how are you? I'm fine, thanks," without going into the deepness of forgiving and building bridges and reconciling with one each other. Any good steers? Any good opening lines?
I mean, I think part of the stop minding reading thing is part of it. So, part of the not building up a false narrative is just saying, can I check something out with you? Am I hearing rightly? Is this the case? I think when I was younger, I did a lot of short-term missions, and one of the things, kind of like many of the leaders in those would say, is keep short accounts. Mm-hmm. So very often we let things build up and build up and build up, and then instead of going with a nice simple thing, we've got this huge tangled mess. So keep short accounts. Don't catch people cold. Very often these aren't corridor conversations, or somebody's in a rush but arrange a relaxed, good place to have a conversation. Preface it by saying, and again, you're not wanting to kind of like make the other person mind read of, there's something we need to talk about. Can we arrange something, 3 months from now? And then for 3 months, somebody's sitting worrying and stewing and building, this big, so don't do don't do that. Arrange, nip it in the bud. Think about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it well. Would be where I would start with. There are some kind of like books that give helpful sentence stems for forming some of this, and that can seem a bit contrived. But these sentence stems work for a reason. They're tried and tested. They don't have the kind of like the ambiguity. There's not the and on that I would do and things like that. So that can be helpful to kind of like use some of those things just to start the conversation. But I think, as Ian said, you've got to, I'm going to use the word you've got to have done the work yourself, so that when you are speaking to the person, it's from a place of, I've done some work here, and it's not that vengeance, angry, bitter, all those other words. That's not where you're coming from when you're having that conversation.
So maybe just to kind of add a little bit to that, I think Brodie's right. That sort of sentence stem stuff can be really helpful. But just maybe to boil that down a bit, using I rather than you can be super helpful. So, and coming at maybe it's more of a confrontation kind of conversation, but I noticed that. It's not putting it all on you. It's here's how this is landing with me. We're quite often unaware of what we do or how we come across or how people receive what we do. And I think this is another my kind of let's fly a kite. I think particularly in church, where you have people from different contexts. So I was reading a book about brain surgery, as you do over Christmas. And in this book, the guy was talking about the conversations that happen in surgery. Give me that knife. Give it to me now. Cut that. Scalpel. Really direct. And if you're in that kind of climate all the time, direct, straightforward. If you're in something else, say you're in the caring profession, and your first line might be, so how are you feeling today? And you have to kind of preamble your way into anything at depth. Put all of these people together, and you've just got a recipe for people taking offence. So I think there's something about actually allowing each other to have a different mode of communication, and having the grace to say, well, so-and-so's in an environment where they have to argue for everything. And they're in an environment where if they argue, then that tone is taken as being something really serious. So I think there's a lot of that kind of stuff that just kind of goes on at a very low grade. But I think saying things like, when I see you, I observe this, kind of just check that in with you. I think that probably is a good place to begin.
Cool.
I think it's worth saying as well. Well, I mean, I'm about to say it, and I hope you agree with me. But this is obviously a huge topic, and there will be people listening, I'm sure, who have areas which are very difficult and painful in their lives, and they may need someone to sit with them and help them through things, right? And I think that there's no shame in that. I think sometimes we're in family circumstances and we might need some outside wisdom in it. We may need some mediation sometimes with things. We may need to be able to do the heart work and then to look for some advice about what the good boundary looks like and so on. And that's valid, right? We're not an island, and we should live in healthy culture, especially in church, and have people around about us who can support us and help us. That would be fair.
Absolutely. I mean, I've kind of found it, maybe I'm doing what you said I shouldn't be doing at the beginning, Jackie, but I found on some occasions I actually have had to speak to people, and to speak to people about things that I have felt or experienced or was reacting to, and felt that it wasn't validated. And I think that might have been that people just didn't want to come into agreement with me, which I get. But at the same time, it also felt like I wasn't quite being heard. So I think it is, finding somebody who, and maybe the people that we need to talk to, you maybe need to frame the conversation by saying, look, I'm not asking you to be my advocate or fight my corner. I'm just really asking you to hear my heart here. And I think if you kind of come into it and frame the conversation that way, It makes it easier for the person who's hearing it because, the stress and the pressure is always, will you come into agreement with me? Will you be part of my gang against the terrible person who's done this to me? And that's, that's the dynamics of the playground, but it's the dynamics that happen all the time. So, yeah, it's very important that we frame what that conversation is like.
And that's the great tip, isn't it, for being a good friend in all of this, is that it's important to be able to say, I hear you, or I've heard you, and I absolutely can hear the pain in all of that, and that you can do the validation at the same time as still calling someone into more life than all of that. And I think we're obviously talking about a massive topic with all sorts of scales of pain and wounding, but I think particularly in the church, it strikes me that there's a choice that we get to make about whether we move towards people or away from people. And it's important for us to understand that in the context of church, we are called to be brothers and sisters together. And that doesn't mean that we need to be best friends with people, but that we need to keep our hearts right with them. And if we feel that we're in any decision, we're either moving towards someone or away from someone. And I think that can be a helpful question. I know from my own heart, it's useful to think, well, what does that result in? What does that behavior result in? Does that result in a potential to move towards? And is my heart towards them? And what does my heart posture look like in relation to them? And to constantly keep checking in that way, because I think very particularly within church, the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And if ever a place that was more evident is within church, and how that manages to be a really, really painful thing. And I just imagine that it grieves God's heart enormously when that sort of feels like the 101 of our faith, and we manage to do it oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes not well. So that's my reflection. Sorry, I went on a rant. It wasn't meant to be a rant. I just had a thought.
It wasn't a rant. It was a thought.
No.
We're coming soon to our close, but before we go to final points, I'd like to ask if anyone's got any. I suppose any story of forgiveness is a good story. Any particular, I don't want to say highlights of forgiveness, seems the wrong word, but good examples where maybe you've been involved with, or you've been alongside someone that's really been a mix of the bridge being built from both sides, there being both forgiveness and reconciliation. You can change the names if you want to tell the story, or give them anonymous names or silly names or something, but anything that you've experienced yourselves that you think people listening, it would be useful for them to hear.
I don't mind sharing first. I shared the testimony at church, just that we had been in church and there had been some wounding, and people had helped me work through forgiveness. And sort of a couple of years after no longer being in that church, I received the most beautiful email apologizing for those exact things. And I honestly just felt that the releasing of forgiveness just released something for them that allowed them the ability to see some things. And I can honestly say, when I read the email, I remember feeling such love for the person. There was nothing live about it anymore within me. And I think that's just the sort of overwhelming thing about forgiveness, is it gives way for things in our hearts that you can't imagine. There's a supernatural, powerful, wondrous thing about what Jesus has afforded us on the cross. It's just sort of incredible and deeply painful all at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. Good. Well, that is us for this week. So we will get one final comment from everybody, a final thought. Brodie, how about you go first?
I think we've already said it. This is a daily kind of thing, and I think the thing that's stuck with me, I've thought about this often, is that sense of the enemy looks for a foothold by saying you failed at this, because as Iain said, very often things can be fractured, and actually what we're doing is dealing with different aspects or different layers of the same offence. So don't listen to the enemy, listen to Jesus, who says, keep doing this, keep at it, and keep on that journey, because there's freedom in it.
Jack?
Yeah, I think just for me, it's the thing of I don't need to write off my pain. There's a place for my pain, but I take it to him and then allow him to hear it and hold me in it, and then allow him to release the forgiveness within me for it.
Great stuff. Ian, you preached it. Final word to you?
Yeah, maybe just to shout out for some great resources that are out there. I think Jackie's already mentioned that book by John and Carol Arnott. Couple of books maybe to suggest: The Lost Art of Forgiving by Johann, Christof, Arnold. It was a book that was out a long time ago. I don't know if you can get that still, but it tells stories of different ways in which we have to forgive, forgiving ourselves, forgiving others, forgiving parents, and just some really powerful stories of forgiveness in that. It'll help us just to see the different dimensions of forgiveness and what it looks like. And then Free of Charge by Miroslav Volf. Also just a really helpful, broad expression of the need and the ways of forgiveness, giving and forgiving in a culture stripped of grace. So I think we can recommend those books. It's always helpful to get resources, I think, just to give you the guidance that you need. I think my final word is it's a counsel of imperfection, and that is that it says in Romans 12 that we are to live at peace with one another. As much as it depends on us. So that is a counsel of do what you can, but it's not going to be perfect. And I think we put an extra level of pressure and expectation on us because we imagine in a church context that we are to be so super sanctified and so perfect in our relationships. I mean, we even put it down to, if we're not perfect, then how will the world know that Jesus is alive and makes a difference? I think we need to show our working a lot more and be a community that shows the process of forgiveness rather than the results of forgiveness, and also shows that we can live with difference. I was really taken by one of the comments that Jerry Gay made when he was on our Transforming event and being interviewed. And he said, diversity needs to be a diversity of thought, firstly, and above everything else. And I think we need to be able to accommodate a diversity of thought and recognise that that's okay. We don't all have to be the same, feel the same, believe exactly the same, or act in the same way. And I think part of the genius of the church is that we do have different people around us. And so I think I would say that to most of us. Look, don't get hung up on being perfect in this, and this will be a lifetime's discipline, but actually it's good for us. It is better to forgive than not to forgive, so walk towards the fire when you see it and walk towards the conflict in your own heart and deal with it.
Great stuff, and thank you, Ian, for giving me the title for this week's show. I think a counsel of imperfection probably works quite well. So yes, do because we're anything if not a counsel of imperfection on this show.
I think that should be the name of the podcast, shouldn't it?
I would rename it. That's not bad, actually. I like that. That's got mileage. That's good. A counsel of imperfection.com coming to a website near you. Great stuff. Well, thank you for tuning in, everybody. Do tune in again to the next show, which will be the final podcast on this particular series on the Lord's Prayer. So we look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.